Greetings, comrades. Do you know what all people born and raised in the Soviet Union have in common? No, not their eternal love for Grandpa Lenin and the party, though of course that too. One thing that unites them is this small red tie. A tie that symbolizes membership in perhaps the largest children's organization that has ever existed. I'm talking about the pioneer organization of the Soviet Union. Let me tell you how this movement was born, what role it played during the Civil and Second World Wars, how it became a forge for perfect communists, and why is this communist movement so suspiciously similar to the Boy Scouts, a movement that emerged precisely in the countries most antagonistic to communism, the countries of the decadent capitalist West. For almost 80 years of the existence of the Soviet Union, these two organizations were essentially opposed to each other. Our pioneers and alien scouts. But let me tell you a terrible secret. The pioneer movement is the Boy Scout movement, just with some communist ideology attached. And the pioneer organization evolved from scouting that emerged in pre-revolutionary Russia. So how did the non-political educational scout movement transform itself into the communist pioneer movement? And how did the motto "Be prepared" become "Be prepared to fight for the cause of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union"? If you read any Soviet textbook, it will clearly say that the pioneer movement in the USSR was established by a decision of All-Russian Conference of the Komsomol on May 19, 2022. The organization was named after Spartacus until 1924, then Lenin died and it was named after him. And not a single word about times before that, as if there were no such period in the life of the country. But there was, so let's start there. It is funny, but still many people who grew up in the USSR believe that scouting is a purely American invention, a soulless replica of our own Soviet pioneer organization. While in fact, the first scouting organization was founded in Great Britain in 1907, and then appeared in Russia only 2 years later, i.e. 13 years before the official establishment of the pioneer organization. The Emperor Nicholas II fully endorsed the initiative, and his son Alexei even joined the Russian Scouts. By 1917, there were already 50,000 teenagers who joined the Scout organization in 143 cities across the country. During the First World War and the Civil War, the Scouts had an important job. They tracked down neglected children, tried to provide social aid and organized teams of the children's militia. With the Bolsheviks coming to power, the Scouts were banned. Scouting was declared to be bourgeois, counter-revolutionary and monarchical. Members of Scout organizations were persecuted, their symbols were torn off and they were publicly denounced. However, one of the founders of the Scout movement, Innokenty Zhukov, wholeheartedly supported the Bolsheviks' rise to power and began looking into ways for the movement to survive. And he found such way, finding support in the person of Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya. She liked the idea of youth detachments. There were only two demands. The first was to work out a new ideology for the movement, which would distinguish it from its Western counterparts and be in line with party policy. The second was to find a replacement for the hated capitalist word scout. Zhukov succeeded in both tasks. It was thanks to him that the word pioneer appeared, and it was thanks to him that millions of children in the USSR wore this red tie around their necks. The role of the ideological component in the movement became paramount. During Soviet times, pioneer movement worked first and foremost as a system for instilling a sense of patriotism, devotion to the motherland and a readiness to defend it in young people. And when we say motherland, we mean Communist Party. It is no wonder that the ideal pioneer in the 30s was proclaimed to be the well-known Pavlik Morozov, a man of really questionable moral principles. But we will talk about the symbols and heroes of the pioneer organization later. Generally speaking, there was nothing particularly difficult in becoming a pioneer in the USSR. Rather, it was more difficult not to become one. Being accepted as a pioneer was one of the most solemn and exciting events in the lives of 10-year-old boys and girls across the Soviet Union. From the beginning of the 1930s, pioneer associations began to be based at schools. The pioneer units consisted of school classes with separate squads formed within them, and one school was one big pioneer brigade. While initially the pioneer units were voluntary associations, once they came under the power of the school, the organization was deprived of absolutely all elements of voluntariness. Basically stopped being an organization as such, it was simply another of many school duties. Pioneer organization accepted children aged from 9 to 14 years. An admission was done individually, open vote, at pioneer assembly or a squad meeting. A pioneer had to say an oath.
Наталья, вступая в ряды Всесоюзной пионерской организации имени Владимира Ильича Ленина, перед лицом своих товарищей торжественно обещаю горячо любить свою родину, жить, учиться и бороться, как завещал великий Ленин, как учит коммунистическая партия, всегда выполнять законы пионеров Советского Союза.
Basically, admission was universal and compulsory for everyone. Yes, technically you didn't have to join the pioneers, but that was basically unheard of. To be rejected, you had to be either the child of the enemies of the people, a hardcore F student, or a juvenile delinquent. In fact, the one true path of a Soviet citizen was to join Little Octobrists at the age of 7, the pioneers at 9, the Komsomol at 14, and then valiantly serve the party. If at any point you have stumbled along the way, there is definitely something wrong with you. Are you a trustworthy Soviet citizen? I don't think you are. For an adult, expulsion from the Komsomol or the party meant one thing: the end of their career. For a child, expulsion from the pioneers was a similar thing, only at the earlier age. An indelible stain on one's biography.
Здравствуйте, ребята!
Слушайте пионерскую зорьку!
So, after all, what distinguished the pioneers from the mere mortals? Oh, there was a whole range of symbols and rituals. The most famous, of course, is the red tie, which was supposed to be tied around the neck in a complex knot. The three ends of the tie symbolize the unbreakable bonds of three generations: Communists, Komsomol, and pioneers. In theory, a tie should have been worn at all times. Yes, even at home. But of course nobody did it. People only wore them at school. Pioneers greeted each other with a pioneer salute, another thing taken from the scouts. The 5 fingers on the right hand, tightly folded, rise above the head. 5 fingers for the 5 continents of the world where people are oppressed, for whose liberation the pioneers fight. And above the head because the interest of the proletariat should be above their own personal interest for the pioneers. The pioneers' motto, "always prepared", was obviously the answer to the call "be prepared", or to the full version of that call "be prepared to fight for the cause of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union".
Юные ленинцы, к борьбе за дело коммунистической партии будьте готовы!
Pioneers also had a special badge, with Lenin's face of course, and a short version of the above-mentioned call. The anthem of the pioneer organization was the Young Pioneers March, a Soviet pioneer song written in 1922. In fact, you could hear it playing in the background of this video. There were also trumpets and drums, flags, banners, ceremonial uniforms and special patches without which no solemn pioneer event could take place. And of course, there were pioneer camps, places where the most outstanding pioneers spent their summer vacations. These were very special places about which we can talk very long. If you guys want, I could make a separate video about pioneer camps in the future. The most famous were the 2 camps, Artek and Orlenok. It was a dream come true for every schoolboy in the USSR to go there. By the way, why were they called pioneer camps and not just camps or child camps like they are called now in modern Russia? Quite simply, if you were to say the word camp or lager to an ordinary Soviet citizen, his first thought would be of a completely different camp, and the phrase "I sent my child to a camp for the summer" would sound very ominous. By the way, I once went to such a pioneer camp. It was 9 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the camp has not changed at all since Soviet times. It was an interesting experience, but to be honest, I didn't enjoy it too much. The only thing I particularly remember was a spooky statue of a kolkhoznica woman, towering gloomily across the river from the camp, in its abandoned part among the semi-ruined cabins. A really creepy place for 10-year-old children. So the pioneer movement in the USSR had one sole mission: to create worthy communists for the country. Nadezhda Krupskaya argued that it was necessary to educate future communists devoted to the motherland and the party since early childhood. Therefore, from the beginning of movement existence, the pioneers were engaged in socially useful activities. The direction of these activities varied according to the demands of the country in different years. For example, during the 1920s and 30s, pioneers were active in the fight against illiteracy and homelessness. They also fought orthodoxy by breaking into churches and disrupting services. With the advent of the Great Patriotic War, the pioneers strove to help the adults in everything in the fight against the enemy, both on the home front and at the battlefield. Pioneers became scouts, partisans, young sailors on warships, helped to shelter the wounded. In the 1950s, the country was recovering from the war and the heavy industry was short of metal. Accordingly, all Soviet pioneers, on instruction from their counselors and teachers, rushed to collect scrap metal. The main points of criticism of the pioneer organization now are that it was too ideologically driven and formalistic. However, at various times, similar organizations were set up not only in the USSR and the socialist camp countries, but also in Western countries. Pioneers organizations were created in UK and France, in Belgium and Switzerland, and even in the anti-communist United States. They didn't, however, survive for very long. Of the countries that still have state pioneer organizations, Belarus, Venezuela, China, DPRK and Cuba are worth mentioning. All these countries have something in common. I can't quite put my finger on what it is, maybe you can tell me. In Russia, the pioneer movement was officially disbanded in 1990, and there is no official state children's movement in the country after that. There are some scout clubs. United Russia occasionally tries to create some kind of equivalent to the pioneer movement with a new political ideology, like the Russian school children's movement. And Gennady Zyuganov still annually initiates hundreds of children into pioneers and hangs red ties around their necks on Pioneer Day on Red Square in Moscow. Some schools apparently still live in the past and organize local pioneer movements on the basis of their schools. But the children who are forced to join them do not look particularly happy. So we can safely say that the pioneer movement is dead. It died alongside the country that brought it to life.